Luke chapter 22. Now the festival of unleavened bread, called the Passover, was approaching, and the chief priests and the teachers of the law were looking for some way to get rid of Jesus, for they were afraid of the people. Then Satan entered Judas, called Iscariot, one of the 12. And Judas went to the chief priests and the officers of the temple guard and discussed with them how he might betray Jesus. They were delighted and agreed to give him money. He consented and watched for an opportunity to hand Jesus over to them when no crowd was present. Then came the day of unleavened bread on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and make preparations for us to eat the Passover." "Where do you want us to prepare for it?" they asked. He replied, "As you enter the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him to the house that he enters, and say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher asks, where is the guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs, all furnished. Make preparations there." They left and found things just as Jesus had told them. So they prepared the Passover. When the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table, and he said to them, "I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God." After taking the cup, he gave thanks and said, "Take this and divide it among you. For I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes." And he took the bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. But the hand of him who is going to betray me is with mine on the table. The Son of Man will go as it has been decreed, but woe to that man who betrays him." They began to question among themselves which of them it might be who would do this. A dispute also arose among them as to which of them was considered to be the greatest. Jesus said to them, "The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors. But you are not to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves. For who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who is at the table? But I am among you as one who serves. You are those who have stood by me in my trials, and I confer on you a kingdom, just as my Father conferred one on me, so that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom and sit on thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat, but I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers." But he replied, "Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death." Jesus answered, "I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you will deny 3 times that you know me." Then Jesus asked them, "When I sent you without purse, bag, or sandals, did you lack anything?" "Nothing," they answered. He said to them, "But now if you have a purse, take it, and also a bag. And if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. It is written, 'And he was numbered with the transgressors.' And I tell you that this must be fulfilled in me. Yes, what is written about me is reaching its fulfillment." The disciples said, "See, Lord, here are 2 swords." "That's enough," he replied. Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down, and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. When he rose from prayer and went back to the disciples, he found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. "Why are you sleeping?" he asked them. "Get up and pray so that you will not fall into temptation." While he was still speaking, a crowd came up, and the man who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus asked him, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" When Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen, they said, "Lord, should we strike with our swords?" And one of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. But Jesus answered, "No more of this." And he touched the man's ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple guard, and the elders who had come for him, "Am I leading a rebellion that you have come with swords and clubs? Every day I was with you in the temple courts, and you did not lay a hand on me. But this is your hour when darkness reigns." Then, seizing him, they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance. And when some there had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him." But he denied it. "Woman, I don't know him," he said. A little later, someone else saw him and said, "You also are one of them." "Man, I am not," Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean." Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly. The men who were guarding Jesus began mocking and beating him. They blindfolded him and demanded, "Prophesy, who hit you?" And they said many other insulting things to him. At daybreak, the council of the elders of the people, both the chief priests and the teachers of the law, met together, and Jesus was led before them. "If you are the Messiah," they said, "tell us." Jesus answered, "If I tell you, you will not believe me, and if I asked you, you would not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God." They all asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" He replied, "You say that I am." Then they said, "Why do we need any more testimony? We have heard it from his own lips."
Good morning. This morning's passage is a long one, and it covers a huge amount of material. So instead of trying to focus on everything that's going on, I want us to focus on one theme that I see running through that passage, and that is this idea of loneliness. We all struggle with loneliness at different points, especially in these last number of months as so much has been closed down and we've been restricted and haven't been able to come to church and see our friends, see our family. We may feel even greater sense of isolation. But being by ourselves is not the only time that we feel lonely. I remember traveling to South Korea and being in a marketplace that is one of the largest in South Korea. They had estimated 10,000 vendors and shops. And when we were there, it was packed with people. But even though it was packed with people, we still felt a little lonely and a little isolated because we didn't speak the language, so communication was difficult, and we didn't know anybody. So we were really on our own. And this idea that you can be lonely or feel lonely even when there are other people around is very prevalent. And I think now that we are in a society that is so connected, we think maybe we shouldn't be lonely. With social media and technology that allows us to communicate with others, we still feel this sense of loneliness, this sense of being on our own. There are some interesting statistics that come out of loneliness. One of the things that has been found is that loneliness, when it's extended over long periods of time, can be as damaging to our health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So as we look at this passage this morning, I want us to focus on 4 types of loneliness that we see Jesus encounter on this last night before he's going to be crucified. We're going to look at loneliness of being betrayed by a friend, and we'll see that when we look at Judas and his situation. We're going to look at loneliness when our friends ignore us, and we're going to see that with how the disciples treat Jesus, and we'll see it in a few different ways. We're going to see the loneliness that comes when a friend denies you, and we know that that's what Peter did. And finally, we're going to look at the loneliness that happens when you are being attacked by your enemies. And we clearly see that when Jesus is arrested. But let's start by looking at the loneliness felt when a friend betrays you. We've all felt betrayal of some kind in our lives from friends who were close to us and have done something that directly harmed us. And this is exactly what Judas did. When we look at the passage, we see Judas making an arrangement with the chief priests to turn Jesus over. And I don't know about you, but one of the things that I ask when I see this every single time is, why would Judas do this? What makes him want to turn Jesus over? He's seen the miracles. He's been with Jesus. And yet he is still going to turn Jesus over? Why would he do that? And I think we can get to more clarity about who Judas is if we look in John chapter 12. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As a keeper of the money bag, he helped himself to what was put into it. This situation in John has come as a woman has used an expensive bottle of perfume to anoint Jesus' feet. And Judas feigns upset because that perfume could have been sold to help the poor. But instead, his real motive is about the money. And John calls that out in the passage. And we see that Judas has placed money above God. Money is Judas's God. It's what he's focused on. But I don't think that that's the only reason Judas betrays Jesus here, because Jesus calls out Judas's behavior in this situation, and I would suggest embarrasses him in front of others. He says this, "Leave her alone. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me." So Judas makes this choice about betraying Jesus. Now, there might be a little bit of confusion here, because in the passage, it says that Satan entered Judas, and that's what caused him, or that appears to be what caused him to commit these actions, to do these things. And maybe we might say that Judas has this, "the devil made me do it" way out. But that's not actually true. Again, the Gospel of John gives us a deeper understanding of what Satan's role in Judas's betraying Jesus was. It says in John 13, "The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus." So Satan didn't make Judas do it. He prompted Judas, and Judas jumped in. Judas went looking for the high priest. He arranged the price and let them know he would arrange a time where Jesus could be arrested and wasn't around lots of people, which is exactly what the high priests were looking for. So how does Jesus respond to this betrayal? Judas, someone who has traveled with him, who has done ministry with him, who had the role of being in charge of handling the money for the group, has now gone out and turned Jesus over. I find it very interesting that Jesus doesn't lash out at Judas, is not angry, or at least doesn't show anger. He simply asks Judas a question. Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? I don't know how Jesus said this to Judas, but when I read it, I get a sense of hurt that something so close as a kiss was used to betray him. Judas didn't point out that's Jesus. He didn't describe this is what he's wearing. He went up and gave him a kiss. The sense of betrayal that Jesus must have felt, this loneliness that a friend so close would do that, must have hurt so much. I had seen a story of a robbery that happened in Cleveland where an 81-year-old woman had been robbed in her home, and the thieves that came in to rob, one of them realized that this woman had been one of his school teachers. And he actually went up to her and said, "You were so good to me," and gave her a kiss before they left with $210 that they had stolen from her. And I wonder what hurt more, the loss of $210 or the kiss from a student that had gone so wrong and made so many poor choices. Jesus understands that betrayal, that closest of betrayals. He knows what it feels like. When we find ourselves in those situations, Jesus understands, and he knows what we're going through. He can relate to that. But betrayal isn't the only way we can be hurt by friends and feel alone. There are times when we're hurt by friends and they don't even mean it. It's where we feel ignored or that they don't understand what's really going on with us. And we see that happen 3 times in this passage by the disciples. The first time is almost implied. It's that Jesus leaves the sacrament of communion with us. That going up to the most important event in human history, Jesus' death and resurrection on the cross, Jesus knew that it was important to leave us with something to remember him, because he knew we would forget. He knew that we need regular reminders. So when we look at communion and we see Jesus telling us and telling his disciples, do this to remember me. Take this bread to remember me. Take this cup to remember me. Think about the loneliness that Jesus feels. Have you ever had to tell someone, don't forget me? How that makes us feel lonely. It makes us feel separated because we know that they're going to. In this case, Jesus knows that we need that constant reminder. And he's right. We sometimes think that when something big happens, we're going to remember everything, all the details, everything on those important days, we're just going to remember. We're never going to forget them. And I can remember on my wedding day, Dean, who was officiating, gave us a verse. I remember that he had told us he gives each couple that he marries a verse for them. And he gave us a verse, and I remember on the day thinking, Todd, remember this verse. This is important. You want to know what this is. I can remember clearly thinking that, but I can't remember the verse. It was important, but sometimes we forget those things, even when they're important, even when they're special to us. We end up forgetting them. That's why we take photos. That's why we make videos of our kids or our family and their friends, because we want to remember those things that are important to us, but we can forget. And this remembrance of communion is a reminder that we need to have. And Jesus knows we need, because even though we recognize Jesus' importance, we are so prone to forget it. And the second thing where we see the disciples ignoring Jesus or not recognizing the importance of something is in this very same conversation. So Jesus is talking about, remember me. Take this bread, remember me. Take this cup, remember me. And then we seem to have this argument break out about who is more important. Jesus is about to sacrifice himself for his disciples, for all of us. And they start arguing over who is more important. How must Jesus feel at that point? Looking at these disciples who he has been with and trained, he is ready to sacrifice his life for them, and yet they are arguing about who's better, who's greater, who's more important. And again, he has to go back and correct them. He has to go back and point them to where they should be focusing. Don't focus on the things of the world about trying to be greater and better and have more people look up to you than your peers, your friends. Focus on being a servant leader. And Jesus reminds them that while on earth the most important person is the person who sits at the table, Jesus came as the one who serves. So he says, for who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who is at the table? But I am among you as one who serves. You are those who have stood by me in my trials, and I confer on you a kingdom, just as my Father conferred one on me, so that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom and sit on thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. The disciples didn't realize that they were ignoring what Jesus had said. They needed to be refocused and redirected back on the things that are important. And Jesus did let them know they were going to be in his kingdom, eating at his table, but that's not where their focus needed to be. And then we see at the Mount of Olives a third time where the disciples are just not able to focus on the things that Jesus wants them to. Jesus goes up to the Mount of Olives, and we see Jesus went as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. When he rose from prayer and went back to the disciples, he found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. "Why are you sleeping?" he asked. "Get up and pray, so you will not fall into temptation." I find it reassuring that in the midst of all this going on, God has an angel come and strengthen Jesus. And you'll notice the burden wasn't taken away. We know that. But that even in this moment of anguish, God was there to help Jesus, to support him. But his friends weren't. In this moment of anguish, where it says he sweat drops of blood, which is actually a medical thing that can happen in situations of extreme stress. Now, I've been in some stressful situations before, but never, ever to the point where I sweat blood. And yet for the Son of Man, the Son of God, to come down and sweat blood because of the weight on his shoulders, and then to turn and see his friends had fallen asleep. They couldn't do it. They couldn't stay up. They couldn't focus. They fell asleep, and Jesus finds them the loneliness that he must have felt. It wasn't intentional. It's not like his disciples wanted him to feel lonely. They had been arguing about who was the greatest and how they would never leave Jesus. And yet they struggled with staying awake. We get even more personal now as we get to Peter's denial of Jesus. And I find this a very strange situation as we look at it over the course of the night. And I want to look at two aspects of it: the loneliness that Jesus feels because of Peter's denial, but I also want to look at the impact of loneliness on Peter and how it affects him. See, as the disciples are arguing about who's greatest and who is the most important, Jesus tells them that they are all going to fall away. We don't see that in Luke, but we see that in Matthew. Then Jesus told them, "This very night you will all fall away on account of me. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered." So the disciples, of course, say, "No, Jesus, we're not going to fall away from you. We are going to continue with you. We will always follow you. We will never turn away from you." And Jesus then focuses on Peter. And he says, "Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat. But I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers." So we see that Satan has asked to sift the disciples like wheat, but that Jesus has responded to Peter in particular that his faith would not fail. And Peter responds saying that it would never fail, that he would go to prison or even death for Jesus. And it's true that he would, and he will. But Jesus responds, "I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you will deny 3 times that you know me." So we see Jesus telling Peter that Peter will deny him 3 times before the rooster crows in the morning. And of course, Peter doesn't think that that's possible. He is 100% behind Jesus. And we see his commitment when it comes to Jesus being arrested. And in this passage in Luke, we read about the servant of the chief priest's ear being cut off by a follower. But we know in John that that follower was Peter. Peter came and was ready to fight for Jesus, to defend Jesus. When Jesus was with him, he was ready to strike out and did, and took action. But it's interesting when Jesus is now removed from Peter, when he has been arrested. And later in the passage, we see what that impact is. We see that while the chief priests and the mob that's come to arrest Jesus, Peter is willing to fight against, a servant girl who comes along and asks him, "You were with Jesus, weren't you?" "I'm pretty sure you were." And Peter denies it. "I wasn't with him. I don't know who he is." And 2 other people come along and ask him, "No, I'm pretty sure you were with Jesus." And he denies them. And when we get this wonderful, challenging, difficult moment between Peter and Jesus, when even while Jesus is on trial and about to be crucified, Jesus turns and looks at Peter when the rooster crows. And I can almost see in my mind this connection that reminds Peter, "You were going to deny me, and you did." The loneliness that Jesus must have felt at that, seeing Peter at his lowest point, his biggest failure. The loneliness Peter must have felt as he looked back and saw Jesus, his Savior, knowing that he had failed. That isolation, so deep, so difficult. But Peter didn't let it stop him. He went and he wept. But we know that he came back. His faith didn't fail, just as Jesus prayed about and asked for, and that he would be strengthened, and he did come back strengthened, and he did come back to help lead and build the church. And finally, we see Jesus left alone to face his attackers, to face his enemies. His friends have scattered, and it is just him. And I know in my life, whenever I have had to face challenges or difficulties, it is always reassuring to have friends, family, when it's work, coworkers, who come around and help support and help encourage. And I can't recall a time where I've had to face something completely alone, all by myself. And yet that's where Jesus finds himself, by himself, isolated from his friends physically, having been denied by such a close friend in Peter, having been betrayed by Judas. This loneliness he must have felt, I can't imagine it. But he still proceeded. He still pushed ahead to the cross. At any point, he could have stopped. He asked God to take this burden from him, but realized that that wasn't the solution. He knew, but he still asked. And God didn't take it. And Jesus, pushed forward alone. There are times in our lives where we're going to feel alone and isolated, whether it's physically separated from others, whether it is just feeling disconnected, whether it's feeling attacked. We all find ourselves in different places at different points. But I find it reassuring to know that our Savior knows what that feels like and knows it beyond even what we can understand and what we will experience. He knows the feeling of betrayal of a friend. He knows what it feels like to be ignored by friends, not understood by them. He knows what it feels like to have a friend deny even knowing him. And he knows what it feels like to be alone as you face your enemies and are being attacked by them. Jesus understands that level of loneliness. If you're experiencing it, if you feel that now, I hope that you can take encouragement that we don't serve a God who doesn't understand. We don't serve someone who doesn't know what it is like to experience the pain and suffering, challenges that come with loneliness. If you're feeling lonely, isolated from others, you can take comfort in knowing that Jesus has experienced these very same things. Even when it feels like everyone has turned their backs on you, with Jesus, you are never truly alone.